Working for you. A weekly talk radio program which highlights developments of national interest and the activities of your St. Kitts Nevis government. Join host Roy Williams as he presents news, views, reports, and interviews about everything regarding the activities of the Team Unity government and the building of our communities and the development of St. Kitts Nevis. Tune in and call in to interact with your government and share your views regarding the upward forward development of your community and our beautiful Twin Island Federation. Working for You is weekly, every Wednesday live from 1:30 p.m. to 3 p.m. on ZIZ Radio, Win FM, and Sugar City FM with rebroadcast on participating stations. Working for You.
Good afternoon and welcome to Working for You. I am Roy Williams. Today we will be having a very lively discussion. We will be talking about disaster preparedness. And in our context, of course, hurricanes. We have a hurricane season every year that begins June 1st and goes down to the end of November. We also will be talking about environmental awareness because we have to be aware of our environment and, in terms of how we treat our environment and how we can mitigate some of the environmental disasters that actually come our way. I have with me some very competent people on my panel to engage you in this discussion on disaster preparedness and environmental awareness. Thank you very much, forget to mention, for joining our program today wherever you are. I will start with Mr. Abdius Samuel, who is the National Disaster Coordinator at NEMA. NEMA, which stands for the National Emergency Management Agency. I think you have at least, is it 1 year yet that you're there?
Just about
1 year. He's at NEMA as the NDC.
Yes.
Then we have Elmo Burke, who is the Senior Met Officer in St. Kitts. And we have Mr. Brian Dyer, who is the Director of the Nevis Disaster Management Department. Welcome to all three of you.
Welcome, and
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Great. Now we'll jump right in. I know we can talk about hurricane preparedness, but we speak about hurricanes under the umbrella of just one environmental hazard. It's a hazard. It only becomes a disaster when it actually happens. The impact.
Right.
So these are some of the terminologies, of course: environmental hazards and environmental disaster. A hazard is a possibility of something happening, and the environmental disaster is when communities are actually impacted and suffer some sort of damage and so on.
Right.
Okay, but let me begin with Mr. Dyer from the sister island of Nevis. Mr. Dyer, how would you define disaster preparedness?
For me, disaster preparedness is the all-encompassing actions that an individual or country can take with regards to personal preparedness, in that you have your disaster plans, you know where your shelters are, you know your communication strategy in the event of all communications going down, where you can find your family, etc. And you know how to reach out to persons outside of community in the event of anything occurring.
Right. So in other words, you're saying that certain measures have to be taken in order to reduce the effects of the disaster, to mitigate the impact of the disaster, especially on perhaps vulnerable communities and vulnerable populations, and how people cope with the consequences and all of that sort of a thing, which we would look at. But what are some of the ways, Mr. Burke, that people can develop geographic and environmental awareness, because we have to be aware we are in a region, the Caribbean region, and because we're in the Caribbean region, it's a zone, most of it for hurricanes. It's also a zone for earthquakes because we're on the Caribbean plate, and it's also a zone also for tsunamis. But in some areas of the world, depending on where you're located, by your geography and so on, you're more prone to certain things. Like I know some places in Asia, like Taiwan and Japan and all those countries, because of where they're located, on the ring of fire or on certain plates and so on, they're more prone to earthquakes and hence tsunamis. You know? But what are some of the ways that people can develop geographic and environmental awareness?
Persons just need to understand where we are located in terms of geographically and the hazards that are prone to pass us on a regular basis. So for example, you would have clearly pointed out, because we're in the hurricane belt, most of the Eastern Caribbean lies within the hurricane belt. So that's one of the major hazards that we are faced with on a regular basis annually. So persons have to recognize that, and you would have also indicated that because we sit on the plate, the Caribbean plate, we are prone to earthquakes. The good thing about, in terms of from a disaster preparedness point of view, hurricanes don't just appear. You usually see them develop, so you have advance warning.
Okay.
Whereas with earthquake is just a sudden shift, because you can have whatever sliding in terms of shift in terms of the plates and so forth, and it would result in an earthquake and then the potential for a tsunami. So once you recognize the threats, understanding where we are located, you just have to prepare yourself accordingly.
Right. So definitely location, where a country is located in the world, determines what kind of environmental hazards that it is susceptible to.
Yes. Yeah. And even when you dig down into it in terms of on an island scale, so for example, you know, most of our storms, whenever the storms are traversing across the Caribbean, they usually come from the east to the west. So you find persons who are more on the eastern side of the island, you're more prone to get the first slash, unless it's a storm that is coming from, which is very rare, which comes from the west. So if you know you're living on the eastern, the southeastern, or northeastern section of the islands, you're most prone. And then persons must also recognize the island is quite small when you compare it to the size of a storm, for example. So most of the time, whenever we're gonna be doing in terms of looking at potential impact from a storm, we at the Met Office, we would try to assess what side of the island is likely to be greater impacted compared to the other, and we will give you the relevant information. However, there are times that the entire island or the entire federation would be impacted, so we would just say St. Kitts and Nevis on a whole, because everybody is likely to be impacted in some way or the other.
Right, and because we are islands, we are not very far from the sea. A lot of the settlements that we have, human settlements, are along the coast. In terms of building and so on, for tourism, we like to build along the coast, so that the tourists, of course, can simply step out of their hotels and onto the beach and so on. But a lot of times, the impact, there's a lot of coastal impact, you know, that happens during, for example, a hurricane. The seas are in turmoil and that sort of a thing, and they can create quite an impact to people living along the coast, to buildings that are located along the coast and so on. So basically what I hear you saying is that where we are in the world, Our geography, our environment impacts our society and it impacts our culture. But not only that, it shapes our society and shapes our culture in terms of the knowledge that we should have, in terms of our environment, and culture being, our way of life. So every year we look forward to hurricane season, and it should become a part of our culture to prepare. Preparation then becomes a part of our culture. It is our way of life. Now, NDC. How can human activity determine whether an environmental hazard becomes an environmental disaster?
It all begins with one thing, and you just said it: culture, tradition. We know, as you rightfully said, and I'm happy that you started that way, with culture. What we practice based on where we are geographically located is what will determine the outcome of the impact by any environmental hazard. For example, are we going to be ignorant of not knowing where our shelters are, as Mr. Dyer said, of knowing that the hurricane season is between June and November, and therefore taking some measures such as putting a little extra dollar aside so that you may have to buy food, ensuring your property, keeping certain areas within your premises clean to avoid having flying missiles to further damage your property, ensuring that you stick to the safe building practices that can determine, and by extension as well, Mr. Williams, also policies and procedures, protocols. So these human activities will determine whether or not the hazard will be a disaster to any country or any island that will be potentially faced with such.
Right, and the because let's face it, you can have a disaster within a disaster.
Of course.
So a disaster and a disaster because somehow human beings did not do what they were supposed to do.
Be simple.
And so a disaster strikes, and because you've not done what you were supposed to do, then you have another disaster on your hand.
Exactly the point. Right.
So you can, in other words, instead of mitigate the disaster,
You
your activity
yes.
can exacerbate or make the disaster even worse.
Correct.
You can increase the impact of the disaster. For example, you mentioned cleanliness.
Yes. Yes.
Cleanliness. And we may think, maybe I can just throw my bottles and my garbage inside the drains and so on. But what happens in the event of heavy rainfall that comes with a hurricane? That creates a problem of drainage, which then leads to a problem of flooding. Correct. Isn't that so?
Correct.
Yes.
And I was informed, and I was in speaking to staff, that's one of the lessons learned, cross-cutting themes, so to speak, that was discussed. Proper waste management procedures and actions by the general public before the impact of a hurricane. For example, some persons waited until they was told, listen, we have the impact, and what they did is that they took the garbage and placed it outside and caused potential hazard to other residents around the area. So improper waste management, as you just rightfully said, in itself, because of the actions of persons not making themselves knowledgeable that, hey, hurricane coming, let us dispose of our garbage, let's take them to solid waste, as a precautionary measure in preparedness, cause a problem. And as you said, rightfully said, clogging of the drains, that leads to flooding. One particular area of such is that, in the fire station, every time in the fire station used to see that drain right in front and Pan Road leading to Frigate Bay Road. always getting clogged and always flooding, and you wonder where all this is coming from. And next you see public health department have to go and clean up these drains because of improper waste disposal. So when you get these notifications, why not exercise the right thing and go and dispose of this garbage at the solid waste? Who will know how to basically somewhat apply whatever security measure to these waste? So these are some of the things, Mr. Williams, that challenge our societies in terms of preparedness.
Right, because if garbage is not properly disposed of, and it is there, you have the elements now, the wind and the rain and everything, that are going to play havoc with your garbage and spread it throughout the community. And it is spread throughout the community, you have another disaster. Because it can create all kinds of things, isn't that so?
Oh, yes.
And not only that, because when you look at it, even if you dig down to it, when you look at it in terms of the improper waste disposal, you can imagine you have improper waste disposal triggering a severe flooding, inland flooding. Then the potential for health issues to develop is there. So as you rightfully said, a disaster inside of a disaster. So you can have this cascading effect. So persons need to recognize that you need to reduce your vulnerability as much as possible, because we can do very little in terms of the exposure. We know if a storm is coming and it's coming, we can't help it.
Right.
But what we can do as a person, as an individual, and as a community is try to reduce our vulnerability, try to ensure that things around us doesn't impact us personally. So that's what we have to try to do as much as possible.
Because after a storm, and if you don't, and I suppose we will get to that post-disaster, but you can have more mosquitoes as a result of a hurricane. You can have waterborne diseases because you don't have clean water, and so on. If you don't have an adequate supply of clean water that is stored up and all that sort of thing, you have to give, the health department has to come into play and tell people how to,
Sanitation is a key.
purify their water and what to do and all that sort of a thing. So it's a very comprehensive strategy that one has to have overall.
Yes.
And disasters bring social and economic consequences. Let's face it. Whether it are hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, as we had in Montserrat some years ago. What are some of the social and economic consequences of national disasters? Some that we have really seen and witnessed in terms of the disasters that we have had in St. Kitts and Nevis.
But Mr. Williams, I'm glad that you touched on the point. Presently, St. Kitts and Nevis is classified as a small developed island state with a GDP that limits the assistance that we can receive from our major donor partners, right? Now, as we keep putting the argument forward, look at Dominica, your GDP can be wiped out by one single storm. Hence, having your country, basically making your country poor. Let's take a look at St. Martin and the struggle St. Martin is having in the recovery process. So therefore, a storm can actually take your economic status down if not properly prepared. No, the argument could be that under some programs such as CRIF, insurance, such as other funds that you may have available, that you should be able to have that recovery plan. But it's not as easy as people think. Today, St. Martin, who you know is a vibrant one-stop shop country or island, is still struggling with the recovery process to getting itself to that normalcy state where they wish that they can be. So therefore, storms can actually bring you to poverty and bring you to your knees, no matter what status you have. Look at the great United States.
Okay, you're speaking very generally.
Yes.
But concretely, what are some of the social and economic consequences, and how do they come about?
Well, let's speak for one. Let me go on the social aspect of things. Storm can bring psychosocial,
Okay.
right? A psychosocial impact on the country, whereby someone who loses everything, and they go through that traumatic experience, can be mentally challenged going forward. When they hear any little wind, when they hear any little thing, that in itself poses a strong challenge, post-traumatic stress and so on, for persons. Other social aspect of things is the disruption to the normal way of life. For example,
Okay.
Our schools can be disrupted. So therefore, for example, look at Dominica, the case in Dominica where St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent, Barbados took a number of their students so that they continue with the CXC programs that they're having. So the disruption to our normal way of life, schools and other things, those are challenging things that can happen with. Also, you spoke about a critical state, tourism. You
Yes.
spoke about the hotels. Impact on our tourism sector can cause many persons to lose employment. So it can have an impact on the employment sector or the labor sector, so to speak. So these are some of the social and economic
Certainly.
things that can be impacted, and I will allow my colleagues as well to share their views. on
You
that.
mentioned a good point, and that is most of our economies, especially within the Caribbean, are built on tourism.
Yes.
Tourism basically can be considered a fragile
Extremely fragile.
industry,
Industry. It is.
given the fact that one disaster can impact the sector adversely.
Yes.
The hurricanes, diseases, let's face it,
Yes.
civil war,
Yes.
political unrest can destabilize the tourism sector. Now, tourism and a lot of our economies too are based on agriculture.
Yes.
Let's face Dominica, for example. Its economy, bananas, the Windward Islands, St. Lucia, and so on. And those crops are extremely fragile, so it does tremendous damage as well to the agricultural sector.
Yes.
And with that, then becomes another disaster. Food security.
Yes.
You see? You were going to say something.
Just to continue on what you were saying about the food security, persons can recall the experience of Irma and Maria, where we would have had a disruption in terms of the inflow of food from neighboring islands as well as from the US, because it was clear to see Dominica was impacted, so we couldn't get the vessels to come in and bring in our regular produce and so forth. But when you look at in terms of the market from the US now, persons never factored that in. So because the Florida would have been impacted from one of them, that is where we normally do a lot of importation in bulk. And because of that, there was a trickle down effect. So it took us a longer time to recover in terms of food security. So those are things that we, in terms of as a nation and as a region, have to factor in terms of our planning. Ensure that we have adequate supply of food, alternate supply of food as well. Because if your major source is disrupted, what is the alternate?
And just to add to this, Brian,
The social.
yeah,
My input with regards to the social impact would be the health aspect.
health aspect, right?
You have persons moving into your country. They may not be screened properly, so you have additional diseases entering your country. There's also the criminal element entering as well, because when persons are forced to migrate from impacted area, we don't pick out to say, we can't help you because of X. We accept everyone. And then now for them to settle in your country, there's a strain on your resources. So it goes both ways. You yes, we can help, but each country have to be some impact, and there's a cost to everything. We may not have the necessary medical facilities to handle the influx of persons. Even for us in Nevis, the persons from Dominica coming in, they were placed on the social, the gender affairs program to assist them in school meals, etc., etc. That was not factored into the budget. So then now the social services director contacted Disaster Management to see if we can assist in any way to continue a program that was forced upon us based on our, our genuine acceptance of our neighbors. Yes. So it has an impact both economically and socially, with it regardless of the hazard.
Right.
But Mr. Williams, I just want to add to a point what Elmo, and a practical point applied to us. I was in Nevis. I was working close with Mr. Brian Dyer during the impact of Irma and Maria. And one of the things we did is that food was flowing from St. Kitts and Nevis, being an importation country in itself. And we were sending food to St. Martin, we were sending food to Anguilla, we were sending food to Dominica, big vessel to Dominica. However, because everybody was in the hyped adrenaline rush of assistance, we really forgot to look at ourselves. Later on, we realized you hear people complaining that they're going to the racks and they cannot get milk, they cannot get this, and they cannot get that. Why? We shipped everything out, and as Mr. Bolt just mentioned, there are three in our discussion with the Chamber of Industry and Commerce. There are three ports that we import food from: UK, the US, and South America. And all but South America was somewhat challenged. And the South American suppliers didn't have everything. And that is not only to food, but also to building material. So you see the impact of a hazard or disaster to a country, especially a country that relies a lot on importation. No, what do we do? We have some discussions with the suppliers and distributors to see how we can mitigate against that. And I could tell you very much, and I could tell the nation that the meetings and the plannings have gone very successful, whereby we have seen that there needs to be an increase in importation during this time.
So there can be a scarcity after a disaster.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so therefore you need to make sure that you have your storage adequate storage of food and all of that sort of a thing. Basic supplies and all of that. So, but we're going to touch on all of that.
Yes,
but I suppose everything else that I would engage you in would follow this question that I'm going to ask. We've spoken about, the social and economic consequences of national disasters. We've spoken a bit in terms of how we can mitigate against disasters, developing geographic and environmental awareness, and what disaster preparedness is all about. All of this is so important. We have the knowledge.
Yes.
And I suppose that is why it is important to have a well thought out national disaster preparedness plan. Because you can have all the knowledge in the world. Isn't that so?
Yes.
But if you don't have a plan of how you're going to execute all of this to prevent the adverse effects and so on, it would not make any sense. So, as the National Disaster Coordinator at NEMA, Mr. Samuels, can you explain the importance of having a well thought out National Disaster Preparedness Plan? And I want you to tell me what are some of the things that are in that plan to deal with what of some we have spoken about before. And of course, the plan, sometimes some places have had national disaster preparedness plan that is heavily concentrated simply on the disaster.
Yes.
But we have to think in terms of pre-disaster and post-disaster.
Right. Yes. Well,
If we don't want to have more of a disaster. Isn't that so?
Yes.
Right.
Well, I can tell you that we have a national disaster plan. It's in existence. The plan is a 4-part plan. This 4-part plan is in line with the comprehensive disaster management strategy that was adopted by CDMO and all its participating states. The plan for St. Kitts and Nevis is a 4-part plan, which is a basic plan which outlines the roles, responsibilities. Then you have the part 2, which deals with terms of reference. Part 3, which deals with the hurricane action plan. And then part 4 speaks about the National Emergency Operations Center and all the responsibility and protocols that it carries out. Now, the plan is very comprehensive and gives the roles and responsibilities of our government and private and social partners so that everybody could have a holistic approach to dealing with any potential impact to the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. In this plan, everything is specified as to what do you do, and Mr. Williams, you have a major part in this as well, as one of the subcommittee chairs. The plan has 10 subcommittees, and these 10 subcommittees cover everything that we just spoke about. For example, we have the utilities that will deal with electricity and water and those basic essentials. We also have health and public health that deals with health matters and public health matters as we spoke about. We also have foreign affairs to deal with all the foreign affairs matters because, as we rightfully said, the major part of our economy is tourism. Okay? Also, we have damage assessment and needs committee, which is headed by Public Works. We have the transportation, because in the event that we have to move a large number of people, how do we move them? Where do we move them to? If the island has to be evacuated, look at what happened in Montserrat, where our own ferry operators here assisted in moving people from Montserrat to other islands and to St. Kitts and Nevis. We also have remember, gentlemen, I'm getting old, so you will have to help me. We also have transportation. We have the education, which you chair, and information committee. So we have all these committees in place that takes care of all the welfare. We have the housing and shelter. We have the relief supplies, welfare and shelter
volunteer organizations as well.
Yeah,
Red
so
Cross.
we have the Red Cross, who is an NGO.
Search and rescue.
We have search and rescue and initial clearance committee. So all these committees come together as stated by the plan and carry out functions to, 1, assist with the response, and 2, to assist with the recovery process. Because you see, Mr. Williams, one of the things I have learned being here is that the recovery is one of the most challenging cycles in the disaster management cycle. Recovery and rehabilitation.
Okay, you mentioned in terms of recovery, response and recovery. What about preparation?
That's one of the key. Mitigation, preparation. Those are 2 of the key areas that we ought to focus on. Because if we could mitigate, that means that it lessens the impact to life and livelihoods, and that is what we want, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Because we want resilience. Preparedness is ensuring that we have all the measures in place that, but when impacted, we can respond to the need and the cries of the people. And that is what is critically important. And that what the plan does, it aligns all these sectors to be able to assist and put the country in a position to continue to respond and continue once impacted. Bearing in mind that Irma and Maria gave us some good lessons, whereby Irma came and Maria came shortly thereafter. So that's why I say recovery is a challenge, because you could say, okay, one pass, people come to the agency, we give them a tarpaulin, but then 3-4 days later, Elmo said, listen, we're gonna be impacted again, you know. So all those people that have tarpaulin on the roof, they're gonna come back again right after. So these are some of the challenges, and I will think Mr. Brian Dyer may want to add something with Mr. Williams.
Alright, well, for us on Nevis, we have a separate disaster plan for the island of Nevis. As you know, there are some unique situations on both islands. Some of the ministries are federal ministries, some are local ministries. So we have what we call the Disaster Management Committee, the Nevis Disaster Committee on Nevis, which mirrors the Mitigation Council at the federal level. This is comprised of heads of department, permanent secretaries, etc. It is chaired by the Deputy Premier. There are 8 subcommittees on Nevis as opposed to 10 on St. Kitts, and we have the cadre of volunteers that assist. The Chamber of Industry and Commerce is a St. Kitts and Nevis component, but the Nevis arm is a part of these subcommittees. So we also partner with Red Cross. They're a critical entity with regards to our assessments in communities or training in communities with regards to preparedness, and also in the distribution of supplies. We have a very robust partnership with the Red Cross.
Okay, good. Yeah. Now, during a disaster, the agencies, the National Emergency Management Agencies or departments, can activate what we call an Emergency Operation Center, which brings together all of the relevant stakeholders.
Correct.
Or heads of the relevant departments, agencies, and so on.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Dyer, in Nevis, when this EOC is activated, what is the response?
Once the Prime Minister or the Premier gives the notice that the EOC should be activated, it is our role at the Nevis Disaster Management to contact the various agencies to let them know that the island is in emergency mode and they should report to duty at the office. The office is transformed to accommodate the influx of persons, and the subcommittees, their roles and responsibility are displayed on the various desks. So persons coming in, even you may be in your post for the first time, when you come to the EOC, your roles will be identified and placed in front of you, so at least you can function. You'll be debriefed, and then you're expected to perform based on what is outlined in front of you.
Right.
And there's a lot of coordination that goes on between the agencies and also with our counterparts here on St. Kitts.
Okay, good. You know, you're talking to people with some experience in NEOC. Both Elmo and I spent nights up at NEMA headquarters during Irma and Maria. And let me tell you, and Jose, let me tell you, it is not easy.
No,
It's not.
It's not.
And then is when I realized that, look, I had to be collaborating with him as chair of the education and communications committee and so on, in terms of getting information out.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he, being the senior Met officer, had to be explaining to people where the hurricane was, how many miles it was away from St. Kitts, the wind, you know, the wind force and the rainfall and all of that sort of a thing. So I come to you, Elmo. You know, what is the role of the Met Office?
The main role of the Met Office is to provide timely and accurate weather information to our stakeholders, and in this case our major stakeholders would be the general public. We also provide information for aviation purposes, and that's why I said stakeholders. However, when we go into the EOC activation role now, my main role as the head of the Met Service would be to provide timely, accurate, and updated information to the entire command center, because each segment of each component of the EOC, in terms of each agency, need advice in terms of what are the weather elements going to be like, so that they can adequately prepare and, if need, respond accordingly. Because there are times that you may have to tell persons, hey, conditions are so poor, it is not safe for you to venture out, so you have to hold off until this time. So I play a key role in terms of advising the entire EOC, and we, at the same time, the information is not just kept within the EOC. As you rightfully said, we partnered a lot during the EOC operation, where once I do my determination and my analysis, the information is channeled to you, and then you filter it out to our various stakeholders in terms of locally, in terms of the general public, and regionally as well, if need be, in terms of to keep CDMA abreast, because our regional stakeholders need to be aware of what's happening, because in the event that there's going to be some kind of impact, most of the time, if they have to mobilize resources in terms of response to assist the island, they now need to know what is the impact, or what is the likely impact that you're going to be experiencing, so that they can start to strategically mobilize things, so that soon after post-impact, they can get the necessary resources in to assist in terms of the recovery and the response.
So communication becomes extremely important. And the role of the media kicks in,
Yes,
even
it does.
more in terms of disaster and so on, because we have to get the message out there. And not only that, the message must be put out there in a timely, it must be timely, that message, and it must be accurate. It definitely must not be confusing. And it definitely must not be so convoluted and difficult for people to understand.
Right.
Yeah. Because what one of the role that we do at the Met Office, and in collaboration with you as the head of the communication committee, is taking complex information, which is meteorology, and try to make it in terms of impact. What type of actions we want to push to you in terms of the general public. So we'll take the complex information, break it down as simple as possible in terms of what actions we want you to take. And as much as possible, years ago, we would just put out the weather information without giving you advice in terms of what are the potential actions that you should take to minimize the impact. And over the years, we recognized that there was a fault and a weakness on the Met Services, and we have evolved over time, recognizing that persons don't just need specific information about the storm, but advice, because the lay persons need to know, well, yes, we know a storm is coming, but what are the impacts? And then based on these potential impacts, what should I do? Because
Know how to prepare.
Because remember, in terms of from the psychosocial component, most persons cannot, you have a lot of persons cannot operate under pressure.
Right.
And when you have a category 5 storm barreling down on you, most persons' brain shut down. So they need to be guided. And that is one of the key role of the EOC. We provide a lot of guidance to the general public and try to keep the general public as calm as possible. So we, as much as we might be under pressure, we have to be cool and calm and collective under as much pressure as possible.
Right, so there goes back there again, we have to be aware of the environment, because the weather falls on the environment.
Yes.
And the climate as well.
Yes.
The environment, all of that comes on the environment. And there's a difference between weather and environment. What's the difference?
Well,
not weather and climate, sorry.
Well, weather is basically short-term, the short-term description of the atmospheric conditions, whereas climate is a long-term average of the weather conditions over a period of years most of the time.
Right, so the weather is short term and the climate is longer.
long term.
So you can speak about the climate of
The
a
climate.
particular area
Yes.
or region and so on. But
That is like traditionally, we would say traditionally saying this is our wet season we are going into.
A wet and dry
ju-
season and so
forth.
on.
So that is our climate.
and that we're in the tropics and so on. Okay, so communication becomes extremely critical before, during, and after. Now we have had some unfortunate situations during disasters, because sometimes you know what happens during a disaster. The likelihood
Yes.
of flow not Digicel, ZIZ breakdown, and so we have the radio stations ain't working just when you need them the most
Right.
is when they fail you. We have to put, I think, systems in place to ensure that these means, these technological means, and mind you, none of us has control over Mother Nature. But we can put certain things in place to ensure that, look, communication does not fail. Because if these means of communication fail, we can have another whole disaster on our hands, you know, because communication is very, very important. What are we going to do? We can't go out there with a loudspeaker, because, I mean, a zinc might come and fly across your head and cut off your neck. There has to be something done to make sure that our communication is robust,
Yes.
that it is enduring, that it is strong. So in the event of disasters and so on, they do not fail us. What do you have to say about that, Elmo?
In terms of, well, based on the experiences that we would have had during Irma and Maria, there's a great need for us to have redundancy in our communication strategy. You would have indicated the potential failure of the traditional communication, whether it be radio, TV, or so forth. So I remember clearly where we in the EOC didn't realize that almost all the radio stations were down.
Right.
So we were pushing out our information to the radio stations, and information must be two-way. For example, if the radio stations happen to go down for whatever reason, they must communicate to us in the EOC so that we can know, well, okay, the radios are down, switch to this media instead. So we need to ensure that we have all of these in place, because we were fortunate that we were just praised by Irma and Maria. Because when you look at, for example, Dominica, I clearly remember at one point in time you had a representative, I think it might have been the commissioner in Dominica, who was talking directly with our commissioner at the time, who was in the EOC. And I had to provide him with the information about what's happening and what's coming to Dominica. Because at one point in time, they were actually in the eye of the storm. And you know, when you're in the eye, you have relatively calm conditions.
Yes.
And most persons wanted to venture out. And I had to advise him, hey, sir, it's the eye you're actually in. So we were using the ham radios, cell phone. His lucky thing, cell phone was up still, and he was able to advise his police and other counterparts in Dominica. The worst is yet to come, and the worst did come. So we have to find ways to ensure that we have redundancy in our communication strategy, not solely rely on in terms of whether it be the mobile or the radio and so forth. And importantly as well, the messaging must be, because you would have indicated the messaging must be accurate. And meteorology is specific. And we would have had, I would say, a kind of unfortunate instances where persons would have put out sensational information. And we have to be careful with that.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Because when you sensationalize the information, even though it might be partly correct during a major hazard, can have a major impact. So you have to rely on the authoritative entity to put out the information, and then you can channel it out and reformat it accordingly. So persons need to recognize that the weather information, the authoritative entity is the St. Kitts Met Office here in St. Kitts, and we work closely with the NDMD, the NDC in terms of NEMA and the communication. So information should be coming from us and then packaged accordingly if need be.
Now, Mr. Burke, you've made a very good point, because I remember during the last 2 hurricanes that we had in 2017, there were people in the name of some news agencies too, and some Facebook page and so on, putting out their own information. Where did they get this information from to put it out? And you are correct, this can send a lot of confusing messages to people in communities in terms of who is the relevant authority. Is this information accurate? Which information must I act on? And so on. And put confusion in people's minds and may create another disaster.
Correct. Agree. Yes.
And when you have those unfortunate situations developing, you find the general public eventually develop a distrust in terms of the information, because they are uncertain in terms of who should I rely on going forward.
And that's a very good point.
And it's scary.
Yeah.
It is very scary, because at the very same time you may say, well, look, all the information is coming, so I am not going to really act because this information is not consistent, it's not accurate, and so on, and so therefore I just disregard that information. When in fact a hurricane might be coming, and because you don't trust the information,
You don't take the
necessary precautions, and so on. And that can be rather fatal. The Easter Sunday, the day of the resurrection of our Lord, for those of us who are Christians, a day which is supposed to signify life and, newness, and all that is good. There are bombings at churches in Sri Lanka. I think you all are aware of that.
Yes.
Where over maybe 300 and something people would have died, and maybe more injured. They took place at Christian churches during Easter celebration.
Right.
Now, one of the things that is emerging is that the authorities knew of these threats, of these hazards, and did not pass on the information. And as a result, what did you have? A disaster. The Archbishop of Colombo in Sri Lanka, the Catholic Archbishop, was saying, look, I think that these people should be fired. Because if I had known this information, if this information was passed on to me, I would have cancelled as holy a time it is on the Christian calendar. I would have cancelled all the services for Holy Week because of to save human life. So I made that point to emphasize how important it is that the communication and it is passed on. Because if you sit on the information that you have, if you sit on it, if you fail as the Met officer to pass on that information to NEMA, for example, or to pass on that information to the public, that look, boy, something is brewing, a serious storm is coming our way, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, boats and all these things have to pack up and whatever, you know. If that information is not passed on to the people and the relevant authorities, then you shouldn't have a job.
But there are
So you understand how important this thing is?
Yes, but there are cases there's a case in Central America whereby the head of the National Disaster, well, you know, they call it Disaster Risk Management Office. He was actually prosecuted and sentenced for the same reason of not passing an information to the general public and causing the death of many people. That was with a eruption of a volcano.
Mm-hmm.
So you are correctly right. The way information is filtered, and that's at this point, you know, it has to be responsibly. It has to be responsibly, and that's why we kept appealing to everyone to listen to the competent authority for that. For example, one thing we hear people saying, "Oh, they go on the internet and they get this information." The information you're getting on the internet sometimes is not relevant. It's generalized. The Met Office in St. Kitts and Nevis is going to provide you information specific to St. Kitts and Nevis. So that is why we keep pleading to the general public to do that. So,
okay, we are going to go to the phone lines while we continue our discussion. There are some people who want to call in. The numbers to call, the overseas number is 1-718-577-2916. That's the overseas number, 1-718-577-2916. And the local number is 465-25-55. We await your calls. Okay, so we're talking about the importance of communication and so on. But let us talk in terms of how can individuals institute their own mitigation strategies. You know, we are talking on one hand about the government and the country, but on the other hand, we have a personal responsibility to institute our own mitigation strategies. Mr. Samuels, how can individuals institute their own mitigation strategies? What are some of these ways?
I love something that you started this program with, geographical location. I just love it because we know we are in the hurricane belt, as Mr. Borg stated. So therefore, you know that every year we are going to go to this period. What can we do? Let's start up from the home. One, developing a plan. You must have a plan. What do we do in the event that we are affected and we are separated, etc.? These are some of the things. Developing a family plan. Two, what about budgeting yourself? For example, if you have to buy supplies, essential supplies, basic supplies, and so on.
Stocking supplies.
Right, stocking supplies. Three, ensuring that your properties, if you are a proprietor, insure your vehicles, insure your property. These are some of the key things that you need to do. Okay? Four, look at your vulnerabilities in terms of vulnerable persons either around you or in your home, or even you yourself. Make sure you have your medications if you suffer from any form of illnesses. Make sure you know where you can get assistance from. Know the persons who are district volunteers. Know where your shelters are. Know the telephone lines for your hospitals or any other agencies that provide emergency during these situations. For example, the Red Cross. Know who to contact at the Red Cross. These are key critical things that persons can do amongst many other to prepare themselves. And also have basic things. For example, I encourage people to buy little radios, have your searchlight. As I said, that's those are basic supplies. Make sure you have a cooler in the event that you don't have a generator. And that's why we need to make one of the way of becoming resilient, Mr. Williams, is when the government have these little incentives of concessionary measures. For example, I remember the government had concessions for persons to bring in generators.
Right.
You investing in one of those generators, if you're a proprietor, that is part and parcel of becoming resilient. Okay, so these are some of the things that you need to do in order to make yourself resilient towards these potential impacts. And one of the things I want to also say, Mr. Williams, even though we're speaking about hurricane preparedness, we are vulnerable to many other. We are susceptible and vulnerable to other disasters, even storm surge. Because you spoke about it, because of the topography of St. Kitts and Nevis, most persons tend to build on the coastline.
Mm-hmm.
The hurricane don't have to necessarily come and pass so close to St. Kitts, but the storm surge alone, like Lenny, can cause severe effect on any country or community. So therefore, these are some of the things. Also, building back better or building practices. It's important for persons when you're building your home, consult not only with the physical planning, but consult even with the NEMA, your local representatives, so you could know what vulnerabilities lie within your community that you're building on. You might be building on a gold mine of hazards. You hear this? A gold mine of hazards. And after you build, it's a challenge thereafter. How many persons do go environmental impact assessment? How many persons actually ask to see what the environmental impact assessment is like when they're building? I could tell you, it's minimal. I have asked many homeowners, how many of you have looked into the environmental impact assessment?
The Bible says, the wise man does not build his house on sand. He builds it on something that is sturdy, so that when the storm comes, it is not battered about by the storms.
Right.
Now, one of the things, of course, that you didn't mention, if I can add,
Sure.
I think, is the structural reinforcement of your roofs and walls.
Sure.
There are some people, their roof is already leaking. Imagine it is leaking in sunny weather. You hear that hurricane is coming. Well, fix your roof. Because it's not going to get any better during the hurricane or the rainy weather. So, and you can't say that you're going to fix your roof during the rainy weather. You fix your roof during the dry period. Make hay while the sun shines. I always hear it when I was a child. You make hay while the sun shines, because you can't fix your roof during rainy weather. So you do what you have to do during the time that you have to do it. Isn't that so?
Yeah.
So the structural reinforcement of your roofs and your walls.
Right.
Families probably should have a plan too.
Yes.
A family plan. The family must have a plan for evacuation.
Definitely.
How you're going to evacuate. And also, one of the things that we don't have in our homes and so on, sometimes we don't have any emergency escape routes, That is why sometimes when you see a fire happening in the house, there's some people trapped in the house.
Yes.
You have no emergency route, exit. So I am wondering, that people, individuals, of course, can put their own mitigation strategies in place.
Definitely. Family plan.
A family plan.
Family plan.
We also have to look at water storage and catchment.
Yes.
Water storage and catchment.
Yeah, that's important, because a lot of persons do not have that facility, and when the government mains goes, they are left without water. There's also a run on the supermarkets for bottled water.
Yes.
So if you're not proactive, you would be behind the eight ball.
Somebody once said something to me. You see, water sometimes they go and go.
Yes.
And some people don't have water, and some communities what. Somebody said to me one time, look, St. Kitts does not really have a water problem. Now that can be debated.
Very much so.
They say what St. Kitts and Nevis has, well, I don't know about Nevis, but I'm talking about St. Kitts, is a catchment problem. Because they said there is too much runoff water. When rain falls, look all the water that comes on College Street gone. Isn't that water be caught somewhere up further towards where it is coming from?
But then you remember you spoke about weather and climate.
Yes.
And I started to think about climate change, and we recognize that our climate has been shifting and shifting significantly.
Climate change.
So we are now
Actually,
having more and more periods of drought.
Drought.
And most persons would recognize for the earlier part of this year, I think it was brown.
Yeah.
We had so many brush fires, and
Yeah.
Mr. Samuel can attest to that.
Yeah.
Tell me something, Mr. Burke. You're speaking about the so therefore we're having more and more drought periods, which means that we're having less rainfall. A drought means that you have less rainfall than you're expected to have in a year, for example, in a period of time. For a period of time. It doesn't mean that you don't have any rainfall, but it just does not meet the demands enough to meet the demands of what you want to use, your use, and so on. Now, a drought also signifies that maybe the place is a lot hotter. Brush fires, you mentioned. We've been seeing a lot of those things. Are they caused? What are they caused by? It's like what is it? Because sometimes I think it's people just doing mischief. What is it?
Well, I will stick to the weather part. So I know because the conditions would have been ripe in that, because we would have had a reduction in terms of rainfall, less rainfall than anticipated for the dry season. So you can imagine a dry season and you have less rainfall for your dry season. So you have an extra dry season. So because of that, now you had conditions ripe for brush fires. And I guess Mr. Samuel, who is a past fireman, you know what I mean? Because from an investigator, he can now attest whether it was spontaneous combustion or, as I said, malicious.
Mr.
Activities.
Samuel, he mentioned a good point. I even forget that you were a fireman before. You were a fireman for many years, so you would have put out a lot of fires. What are some of the causes of these fires? Because let's face it, even during a disaster, we're talking disaster preparedness and so on, you can also have fires created by downlines and things like that. But right.
Well, I think Elmo touched on it, but I can tell you from experience is that one of the things too is one, the malicious use of fire by people. Two, the careless use of fire. For example, sometimes if you realize that a farmer might just want to clear a piece of land and he don't take into consideration the landscape, the wind directions, the topography of the land, etc. So he just think, okay, if I could just burn here, burn there, and burn there, this wouldn't happen. So it ends up that sometimes these fires end up spread beyond acres and acres and acres than what they think. There is a very high debatable discussion about the spontaneous burning in terms of having an opaque object within the fields or the grass that has to be basically penetrated by sunlight in order to create that level of heating to create combustion. It's a highly debatable. For example, once ago the teacher will give us a magnifying glass, and you put that magnifying glass to the sun and you put it on your skin and you will see. However, some testing has shown that it takes a while for that to happen when it comes to the outside in the environment. But it's a possibility as well. But spontaneous combustion through an opaque object, meaning an object that magnifies the sun and actually enhances the heat to cause combustion. But most of the times is the malicious use of fire or the careless use of fire by people.
Okay. Now we're talking disaster.
Yes.
And of course, when you have this sort of a burning down of the brush and trees, the forests, or whatever the case is, you are removing a barrier in terms of topsoil. And you also, when the rain falls, there's nothing to intercept the rain from hitting the ground directly.
Correct.
And so therefore you can create in a heavy rainfall, which hurricane brings with it, you can create more soil erosion and all of that sort of a thing. So there you can have another disaster. Which is, and because when you're burning, and it's sort of environmental degradation. Apart from the burning is also polluting the environment. and creating sickness and all kinds of with those with asthma and respiratory problems. Yeah.
And I'm glad you brought up that, because when you look at, in most instances, after we exit a dry period, and we get a heavy downpour. Especially if you look at the last few months, where basically almost like the entire landscape was burning.
Yeah.
So you found most of the shrubbery, the topsoil and everything was loose and burnt away. So we would have just had consistent light to moderate showers. But it adds up. You don't have anything now to actually prevent the water from running off like normal.
Yes.
And that's what happened on, I think, Saturday, Sunday,
Yeah.
where we would have seen some of the guts came down.
Yeah.
So we went from a drought, and it just one trigger, because we didn't have any heavy shower for a prolonged period of time. But because the soils were loose, everything just ran off.
Another aspect to the when you burn the trash or vegetation, the ash leaves a seal on the topsoil too. So whenever we have some moderate showers, instead of the water percolating, it acts as a barrier, and you have a lot more runoff than usual.
Right. Okay. So it doesn't percolate into the soil.
Yeah.
Now, Mr. Burke, I'm still on you. Now, in 2018, the Lord was merciful to us.
Amen.
Very merciful to us. We prayed a lot and so on, and we did not have any major storms and so on affecting us. Now, that was 2018. In 2017, of course, we had Irma and we had Maria. Now, we didn't get the full brunt of both of them, but nonetheless, they created some problems, some damage. What is the forecast, the 2019 forecast for the Atlantic hurricane season?
For the Atlantic hurricane season for 2019, and this is the early forecast. These forecasts will change as we go deeper into the season. We are looking at a possible 13 named storms, and 5 of which are expected to develop into hurricanes, and 2 or 3 should develop into major hurricanes. And when we say major hurricanes, we're looking at category 3, 4, 5. So persons need to bear that in mind, but at the same time, it only takes one tropical cyclone to create a disaster, because if you're not prepared, even a tropical depression producing copious amount of rainfall, significant amount of rainfall, can create a disaster. So it doesn't take a hurricane or a tropical storm only for it to become a disaster. If you're not prepared, whether it be for any kind of tropical cyclone, it could be a disaster, whether for you as an individual or for we as an entire country.
Okay, good. Now, persons with disability, there are some persons during a disaster who are more vulnerable than others. You have people with disability, you have children, you have pets, because sometimes we never think of our pets. But in a humane society we really should. Mr. Samuel, what is in place for people with disabilities and so on?
One of the things that we have engaged seriously in is doing some vulnerability mapping for the persons with disability. The person with disability mapping basically is where we identify in different villages based on the information provided to us by the community officers in collaboration with the district volunteers, along with the Association for Persons with Disability, where we just had a workshop with them, having them give us inputs as to how we can develop a plan specific to them within the general scope of our national plan to provide with them. What do we have in place is that we have identified 1 or 2 shelters in particular for that can cater to them and the needs that they have. 2, we are continuing a campaign where we're asking family members, because that is something that was said to us, where we have family member identify either themselves or another family member to be able to accompany persons with such a disability to the shelters or take them in their homes to assist them during these times. We're also ensuring that we can meet their needs in terms of structures. What do I mean by that? How do we get communication to them using whatever language means or whatever means necessary so that they can understand and they can be catered and identified for within our society. So these are some of the things that we are we have worked on and we are implementing and are already available for persons with disabilities.
Okay.
I will let Brian speak to Nevis.
So people who are deaf, people who are blind.
Right.
I know they have more politically correct terms, but
Yes.
when
Yes.
I was studying in Trinidad some time ago,
Yes.
I used to work with people who were deaf.
Right.
At the touch of crisis in community, if I remember what name it was. And the lady who was in charge there said to me that she doesn't want the use of these politically correct terms about hearing impaired and so on. Deaf is deaf. And she had her reasons for it. But no.
Right. On Nevis, we have a similar program as what is done on St. Kitts. We rely on the Ministry of Health and our volunteers in the communities to identify persons with disabilities. On the approach of a storm, we would give first preference to these persons to move to our shelters, and we would use the means of the medical team to transport these persons if the family could not assist. These persons are provided special attention in the facilities and made as comfortable as possible.
Yes.
Shelter life is not the best life, but once they are comfortable in this situation, they are provided updates with regards to what is going on and are involved in the activities within the shelter.
How many registered shelters Nevis has?
We have 24 in the books.
24?
Yes.
That's a lot.
Yes,
for small place.
they could only hold, our maximum capacity is 1780.
They're small.
Yes, they're very small.
Okay.
The largest facility can hold 140 persons. About that, yeah.
And Mr. Samuel, how many does St. Kitts
I
have?
can't give you the exact count. The reason being is that the list almost every year has to be updated
revised.
and revised, and sometimes the list is not approved by the agency, it's approved by cabinet. So sometimes when we send it to cabinet now makes addition. So unless we have the approved list, we don't really estimate and say we have 10, 20, because then when you put that information there to the general public, then they're holding you to the first information that you put out. So unless we have the approved document list from cabinet, then we don't really say, well, we have 10, we have 2. But what I can say to you is that we use most of the community centers, we use churches and a lot of private property as well from our social partners as shelters. One of the good practices, a better practice,
schools.
We don't use schools. And I could tell you this much, and I feel proud of it. In a ministerial forum that we had with Southcom and the State Department in the United States, St. Kitts and Nevis was one of the few OECS, or by extension Caribbean islands, that does not use any schools as shelters. Right? Most of them were in surprise because they said, well, that is what they have and that is what they use. And hence the challenge Dominica faces right now, getting people out of some of the schools.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, but what is the condition for shelters? Because I want to know that if I am leaving my home to go into a shelter, I should not be getting wet.
Yes.
Because I wanted to be dry in the first place because my house was leaking.
Yes.
So I want to go into a shelter that is in a very good, I am not expecting heaven.
Yeah,
but at least to leave from where I was, where I was getting wet, to go somewhere where I getting wet. So the shelters must be in certain conditions. Mr. Dyer, I see you laughing. Tell me why you're laughing, Mr. Dyer.
Well, I laugh because the authorities usually do their best with regards to repairing these facilities on an annual basis. I have been fortunate enough to use grant funds to repair 10 community centers on Nevis. and we try to maintain these as the benchmark for the other shelters. However, life in a shelter is not easy. Based on the criteria for space allotment, it's 9 square feet for a person sitting down with your luggage, and 15 square feet lying down. So I usually joke and tell person once they're over 6 feet, you're encroaching on your partner. So it's something that we have to take seriously, though. It's not a bed of roses in a facility.
Yes, and people must expect that. You can't go into a shelter and expect that is your palace.
Yes.
And that there are certain adjustments that you have to make.
Yes.
And that's another issue, in disasters, and I think you touched on it, Mr. Samuel.
Yes.
The psychosocial component.
Yes.
Because you're socially displaced,
Yes.
let's face it.
Yes.
And with that comes some sort of a psychological burden,
Right.
and so on. And you have to be prepared to deal with that as well. Maybe your house is gone,
Right.
and you're here in a shelter.
Exactly.
But all you're thinking about, Lord, is my poor house that's gone. And all that has gone with my house.
Correct.
And so therefore, for example, counselors
Yes.
provided at these shelters,
They are part of the shelter team.
they're part of the shelter team.
Yes.
So that psychosocial component is important.
It's important.
And then you're also with people who you've never been with before. Lord, and I wish I didn't have to be with this person here, because they're so
Yes.
cranky and they're so
Right,
miserable.
Right.
It's the adjustment can be quite huge.
And we have to realize that there's a registration process at the shelters. You just can't show up and barge in. There's a registration process. So the authorities will know if there are any ailments, what the feeding program, how it fits your special needs, etc., etc.
And you can't go in the shelter before the storm. Is that
Yes. We usually identify or set the time for our volunteers to set up these shelters. I remember, I think it was for Irma, we had persons calling and abusing that having a shelter open at 4 p.m. was too late for them. But we have to give our volunteers enough time to secure their premises, their family, and then make the trek to the community center and establish the procedures for the shelter to be operational. So we have to set guidelines and limits. What we find too, that some persons that came out of Maria, they registered at the shelter and they went back home. And when things got treacherous for them now, they call in the department, need assistance to move them from their home back to the shelter when they were already registered. You have to abide by the rules.
Yes.
And we maintain contact with the shelters as far as practicable. We have established VHF radio with some of the shelters in the community, so we can have an idea how many persons are registered, so we start to plan the feeding process. Right? We try to pre-stock some supplies, because some persons, even though you identify what they should bring to these shelters, they still show up empty-handed. So we are lenient, and we try to be proactive as well in providing some supplies to pre-stock these shelters, so when persons get in, they can fit in and be as comfortable as practicable.
Right, but in any event, shelter availability and management during and after a disaster is very, very important.
Mr. Williams, may I say though, very quickly?
We have to be wrapping up, but
right?
yeah.
That, what we encourage is that your first shelter should be your home.
Okay.
If you don't feel comfortable that your home can withstand, then we encourage you to go to the shelter.
Certainly.
However, the practice has been in the past that shelters open post after the storm. However, because of what was observed in 2017, and I guess you and Elma would have been exposed there, the Mitigation Council Minister decided to open a shelter in each district, which is the 8th district. We use the electoral districts as our district boundaries as well. In each district, so that persons who don't feel safe within the property, knowing those monstrous storms that were approaching us, that they could have gone to these shelters prior to, but as Brian said, you have to walk with your own things, and that is where preparation, adopting that culture of preparedness, comes into being. Remember, you asked the question earlier: how can one do these things? And that's part and parcel of planning.
Yeah.
So walk with your basic items that you will require, and then post impact, we will assist you.
Right.
Right.
Now, several roofs were damaged during the 2017 Atlantic hurricane season. People need to make sure that there is structural reinforcement of their roofs and their walls. And you mentioned as well buying insurance. Now, the government undertook, and the government is to be commended, undertook a roof repair program where several homes assessed by NEMA
Yes.
were in need of roof repair.
Yes.
And that brought tremendous relief
Of course.
and psychosocial satisfaction to many people in St. Kitts. Because you need a good roof over your head.
Of course.
You don't want when rain fall, you have to be, as we say, cringing up in a corner. You know? And I think, as part of the repair, the government came in and did some very, very good help to people. That is that is rather to be commended by the government, and you can see the joy and so on people's face. You know, because let's face it, it's hard to build back. It's hard to build back anything. It's hard to build back your house. It's hard to build back your life, especially when it has been affected. It's very hard, and the recovery stage of a disaster, you know, people need a lot of help, and they need, you know, people get depressed, and people, you know, sometimes, you know, all of your savings and so on, you know, was wiped out, and you don't have any left, and that is when people really need the help, the psychological effect and so on. So, you know, we're dealing with a lot of different things, and then we need volunteers as well.
Definitely.
With disasters. You know, we have the Red Cross and so on. We have these organizations, but we need other people to sign up for volunteer work and so on, you know.
Yes. And I'm appealing to persons, because our first responders is not the police, the fire, and the EMS. The first responders is our communities.
Right.
So we are appealing to the general public to come on and support NEMO, become part of the volunteer. It's part and parcel of nation building. So if you want to have a resilient nation, you have to play a role. And one of the best way of playing a role is volunteering.
Volunteerism. Now we're out of time, and I give each of you a minute to wrap up.
Since I started first, let me end first. Alright, it was a pleasure being here. From the lens of the Nevis Disaster Management Department, I would like to encourage persons. We're going into the hurricane season, comes the end of next month. And one person to be prepared. Be prepared, get your house in order in terms of your disaster plans, your communication plans, trim your trees, clean your drains, etc., etc., and become a volunteer. It's important, and also you can get some training from either the Red Cross or the Disaster Management Fraternity. It's important that you're aware of the hazards and risks in your vicinity and know where your shelters are. Most importantly, you can get more information from the Nevis Disaster Management from our website www.ndmd.kn, and you can call us 469-1423. And be safe. If you can be safe, be careful, but get your house in order for the upcoming hurricane season.
Elmo?
Just to let the general public know that, as I said, we are approaching the hurricane season, and the hurricane season is just an average of when storms are likely to develop. However, if persons are really monitoring the website, as most do, you would recognize that there's already a disturbance out there right now, up by the Bahamas, that NHC, which is the National Hurricane Center, is already monitoring. So it goes to show you that hurricanes and storms don't wait until June the 1st to start to appear in the region. They can appear anytime. So persons need to ensure that they are in a state of readiness and so forth. And to add to what my colleagues would have indicated, volunteer. We have so many community and social groups out there, such as Red Cross, because I'm the president of Red Cross as well, and I'm advocating for persons to consider Red Cross as a viable option. It is not for pay, mind you. It is not for pay.
Volunteerism is not for pay.
Yeah, no, but because some persons think about volunteerism in terms of I do something with expectation in mind.
Yeah, quid pro quo.
Yeah, but it's a satisfaction to know that you're helping somebody when they're at their lowest. That is what a volunteer should be really pushing. So I would encourage persons out there, especially young persons, able persons, even persons from the Spanish community, join Red Cross.
La comunidad dominicana.
No Espanol.
Yes. That's why I want to first thank my colleagues for coming out to join us, and thank you and ZIZ for hosting hosting the National Emergency Management Agency and its partners here. I want to ask the general public and encourage the general public to begin to be prepared.
It's okay.
And I think that is my encouragement for them.
Okay, well,
let's be prepared.
Sure. Now I want to thank all three of you. Today we have had Mr. Brian Dyer, who is the director of the Navy's Disaster Management Department, Mr. Elmer Burke, who is the senior Met officer, and Mr. Abdias Samuel, who is the National Disaster Coordinator at NEMA. Thank you to all of you for coming on today's program and for sharing and engaging in such an important area, that of disaster preparedness and environmental awareness. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank all of you who listened to today's program and all of you who continue to patronize this program from week to week. Thank you very much for tuning in. I am Lesroy Williams. Next week we will be back for another edition of Working for You.
Working for You. A weekly talk radio program which highlights developments of national interest and the activities of your St. Kitts Nevis government. Join host Lesroy Williams as he presents news, views, reports, and interviews about everything regarding the activities of the Team Unity government and the building of our communities and the development of St. Kitts Nevis. Tune in and call in to interact with your government and share your views regarding the upward forward development of your community and our beautiful Twin Island Federation. Working for You is weekly, every Wednesday live from 1:30 p.m. to 3 p.m. on ZIZ Radio, Win FM, and Sugar City FM with rebroadcast on participating stations. Working for You.